All right, today we are going to talk about the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance can be divided into two parts: the Italian Renaissance, which came first, and then the Northern Renaissance, which happened in modern day Germany, France, England, the Netherlands, that part of Europe, right? So, first came the Italian Renaissance, and that's what we're going to be talking about first here. So, the word Renaissance is the French word meaning rebirth. So, when we talk about the Renaissance in Europe, we're talking about this time of a lot of great cultural change, a lot of achievement, a lot of discovery that kind of brought Europe out of the Dark Ages, so to speak. So, this is the time when the late Middle Ages becomes the modern era, so to speak, the Renaissance, and then later on the Reformation. So it was a period of renewed interest in the culture of classical antiquity. So the ancient times like ancient Greece and ancient Rome, this renewed interest in that time period and those cultures after about 1,000 years of them not having existed. This was also a period of kind of economic revival after the Black Death. Remember me talking about how since so many people died, afterwards there was kind of an economic revival. A lot of people got employment because there were so few people to work. Okay, so after the Black Death, you have this economic revival combined with this period of renewed interest in the cultures of Greece and Rome, and that's what we call the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance began in the city of Florence, Italy. Florence, Italy, all right, and that's where Florence, Mississippi comes from as well. It's named after the city in Italy. It actually began in the 1300s, so what we think of as the late Middle Ages. Now, this was the birthplace of the Renaissance for several reasons. First, it was the richest society in Europe at the time. Italy was very wealthy. One of the reasons why they were so wealthy is because the Ottoman Empire traded so much with Italy, specifically with Venice. So you have Florence, Italy, another very affluent city at this time. And throughout the late Middle Ages, both with trade, as I said, and also through specialized industry in cities, Italy became very wealthy. So this wealth allowed for people to have money to spend on non-necessities like art and like really cool buildings and things like that. So it allowed Italians to patron artists and architects, which means pay them to do something. And it also allowed Italians to make expensive clothes and produce very high quality paint. And in order to make a great work of art, your material has to be good. Just like you can't bake a good cake without quality flour, all right? You can't make a good painting without high quality paint. So all this wealth that was bubbling up in Italy allowed the Renaissance to take place. Now, it's impossible to understand the Renaissance without talking about one family, and that is the Medici family, the House of Medici. So this was a very wealthy and powerful family in Florence. They pretty much ran the entire city. And then, with the help of a handful of other powerful families in Florence, they really fostered and inspired the birth of the Italian Renaissance. They patroned the arts and funded education. They cared very much about the arts and had tons of money to spend on hiring artists and architects to paint for them and to make sculptures for them and to build extravagant buildings for them. And they, like I said, essentially ran the city, but because of all their money and how they spent it, they fostered and inspired the Renaissance to take place. So the Medicis were the richest family in all of Europe at that time, not just in Florence, not just in Italy, but the richest family in all of Europe, one of the richest families in all of world history. And that's how they were able to instigate what we know of the Renaissance. Now, the House of Medici became wealthy and powerful through trade. They made their fortune through textile trading during the late Middle Ages, both with the Ottoman Empire and with other countries around them. So they were able to fund the Medici Bank. After they had made their fortune, they made even more of a fortune through banking. And this gave them a lot of political power and influence. If you control the money, a lot of times you control the politicians, which means you control the country, or at least the city. So this gave them a ton of political power and influence, and they caused kind of a capitalistic society to form in Florence, this type of free market where people had this new opportunity to make a lot of money if they were willing to work hard because the Medicis could fund them. So this caused their wealth to grow more and more while causing other people's wealth to grow at the same time. So they were really smart business people. Now, the Medici's influence even stretched into culture and religion. It wasn't just politics, they were also very influential in culture and religion. They dominated the government of Florence. As I said, they created an environment in which art, architecture, and education could really flourish, could really thrive because of the culture that they created. And on the religious aspect, you have three popes who came from this family of Medicis. Three different popes, leaders of the Roman Catholic Church. They didn't have hardly any training. They just had a lot of money, so they pretty much bought that position. And remember, the Pope was pretty much the most powerful person in the world. So a lot of, or at least three popes came from the Medici family, just bought their way in, including Pope Leo X. And one of you guys did their project on Pope Leo X, so you can probably remember that presentation that we listened to. But remember, Pope Leo X was the Pope during the Reformation, which we'll talk about next class. Now, the Renaissance lasted until the 1600s, which is what we call early modern Europe. And there are achievements in all sorts of different categories. There are a lot of different areas in which Renaissance artists, men and women, really achieved a lot of impressive things. First of all, let's talk about painting. Painting was hugely influential, and it really took off during the Renaissance, and a lot of people say the best paintings of all time took place during the Renaissance in the 14 and 1500s. You have people like Michelangelo Buonarroti, you have Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci, you have Raphael, all these amazing painters of the Italian Renaissance. They were all from the same place, they were working around the same time, and they're just creating these magnificent works of art. Also, you have architecture, especially this guy named Filippo Brunelleschi, who constructed the dome that we looked at a couple slides ago, if you want to go back and look at that. Just state-of-the-art, really groundbreaking type of architecture that was happening, this new type of engineering, very intellectual, that was going on at this time, all sorts of new achievements in architecture. You also have sculpture. Michelangelo is one of the most famous sculptors of the Renaissance. You have philosophy. You have this new type of philosophy called humanism, which we'll get to a little bit later. Science as well, with people like Copernicus and Galileo, all coming out of this time and place. And then you also have the period of exploration. You have people like Columbus, who certainly would be classified as a product of the Renaissance. Now, it all started with this guy named Petrarch, and he was the first Renaissance humanist. When I say it all started, I mean Renaissance philosophy started, just to be clear. That started with a guy named Petrarch. He made a really important discovery. He rediscovered the writings of a guy named Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, and he was an ancient Roman philosopher. And with the rediscovery of Cicero's writings, Petrarch found kind of a gold mine. And through this, he really sparked a renewed interest in ancient Greek and Roman writings and art and architecture just through the rediscovery of Cicero's writings, and helped to start the Italian Renaissance. So Petrarch was a scholar, he was an author, he wrote poetry, and he also influenced a lot of later Renaissance thinkers, who we'll talk about a little later. He's also the first person to ever call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages. That's why we sometimes call it that. Petrarch was the first one to coin that term. It's not like people who were living in the 11th century said, I'm living in the Dark Ages. No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't until the 1300s, when Petrarch came along, that people actually started calling that time period since the fall of Rome the Dark Ages. Now we get to Leonardo da Vinci. Now, we heard a really good presentation about Leonardo da Vinci a few days ago in class. A little bit more about him. He was one of the greatest artists of all time. A lot of you guys probably already know that. And his two most famous works are the Mona Lisa, which you see right there, probably the best known work of art in the world, and also objectively the most visited work of art in the entire world. It's worth an estimated $100 million. It's housed at the Louvre in Paris, and just simply put, the most famous painting of all time. And then he also painted The Last Supper, and this is the most reproduced religious painting of all time. I'm sure that'll look very familiar to you when we look at it. But Leonardo da Vinci also conceptualized a lot of different inventions in his notes, okay? Inventions to where we get things like the hot air balloon and all sorts of other things that had their beginnings in Leonardo da Vinci's notes. And he just showed this uncanny understanding of almost every single academic subject. Now, a lot of us are really good at one or two subjects, but he was good at everything. He was a literal genius. He is what we call a Renaissance man, which we'll also get to in a minute here. But here is the Last Supper. This is his probably his second most famous work, the most, as I said, the most reproduced religious painting of all time. Here at the center, you have Jesus, and then you have his 12 disciples. This is in the upper room, the Last Supper before Jesus was crucified. Now, if you just look at this painting, just look at all the geometric accuracy here. I mean, you see everything kind of slanting inward. If you follow my cursor there, everything kind of slanting inward toward Jesus's face. Is showing that he is the center of the painting there. And if you look at the figure of Jesus himself, he's kind of looking like a triangle, okay, another geometric shape there to kind of symbolize the Trinity, and just so many other things that went into this painting. Really shows how Leonardo really had a firm grasp of mathematics and of perspective and all sorts of other great things. Then, of course, you have Michelangelo Buonarroti. A big debate is who was better, Da Vinci or Michelangelo? Well, they were both absolute geniuses and really fantastic. So Michelangelo was also one of the greatest artists of all time, and he is most famous for painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling over the course of 4 years on his back on a scaffolding. Imagine that. He didn't just paint on a canvas. He actually painted the ceiling, a very high ceiling in a cathedral. And he painted the entire ceiling, and it wasn't just like he was painting it one color. He was painting very detailed images from the Bible on there. It took him 4 years on his back every single day on the scaffolding. Just how painstaking that would be and how meticulous and how tedious it would be. It really shows how impressive Michelangelo was. He also sculpted David, the sculpture you see in the picture there at the top right, and he also sculpted the Pieta, which is the sculpture at the bottom there with Mary holding her son Jesus after the crucifixion. So two of the most famous and really greatest sculptures of all time. So Michelangelo and Da Vinci are seen as the two premier artists of the Italian Renaissance. Just right here is a picture of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So you have the entire thing right here. So you can understand why it took him 4 years to paint this entire ceiling here. You have so many different scenes from the Bible, different people from the Bible, to really illuminate a worship experience there. And the most famous part of the ceiling is this part right here, okay, where I'm circling, and I zoomed in on it right up here. I'm sure we've all seen it. This is the creation of Adam. This is a creation of the first man. And in this picture here, you have God reaching out to put life into Adam right here. So right here, one of the most noted parts of this painting is this part right here with the hands. As you see, Adam's hand is kind of limp right there, yet God is touching out to kind of put that message that it's kind of God who does the action, and we don't really at all. So all sorts of things that Michelangelo put into his paintings. It's really too much to go into too much depth about all of it, but that's just one example right there. So that's the first half of the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, and the second half is called the Northern Renaissance because it took place north of Italy. Now, the Renaissance changed Europe and world history in a big way. It ushered in this era of secularism, rationalism, individual thought, through this kind of rebirth of the arts, of new ideas, and really different types of cultural growth. We talked about the lack of cultural output in the Middle Ages, and that really changed during the Renaissance. Okay, now you have all these new ideas and all this cultural output being pumped out on a very large scale. Now, at the time, the change was mostly experienced by rich people and by the artists that they hired. It wasn't really experienced too much by the peasants because they didn't really have money to patron the arts, and a lot of times they didn't have the skills to make art themselves. However, the impact of the Renaissance has spread much, much more over time. So it's not like all of the world experienced the Renaissance in the 1500s. No, only some of Europe did, but over time, what happened during the Renaissance has really impacted the rest of world history. So, in order to describe Renaissance art, we have to recognize that it focused mostly on the human form. You don't see much Renaissance art that's just like a landscape. You don't see much of it that's abstract either. It's all focused on people, which is my favorite type of art. That's focused on actual people. So it's focused on the human form, trying to get the human form exactly accurate, and most paintings and sculptures featured people, just like that of ancient Greek and Roman art. And the style of painting and the style of sculpture that was both respected and pursued during the Renaissance was called detailed realism. Detailed realism, trying to get as detailed of an image as we can of the human form and trying to make it look as realistic as possible. So there were no cameras back then, there were no photographs, but these days we might say the purpose of detailed realism is to make it look as much like a picture, like a photograph, as you can without actually taking a picture of it. Now, Renaissance architecture also borrowed from ancient Greece and Roman architecture. It featured four or five different types of architecture and engineering strategies. First, you have columns. Okay, we all know what columns are. You see that featured here. You have things like Corinthian columns in ancient Greek and Roman architecture. You have triangular pediments, which you see on this building right here, how houses come to a point, and a lot of other buildings do. That all started in ancient Greece and Rome. You have pediments, you have arches, okay, like you see right here. Okay, and you have domes as well. This is Brunelleschi's dome, Filippo Brunelleschi's dome in Florence. Right, so you have all these different, very difficult forms of architecture that are really just beautiful and make for great buildings. And the Renaissance was a time of this rediscovery of Greek and Roman art, architecture, writings, ideas, you name it. It was the rebirth of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Now, before the year 1500, the Renaissance was almost entirely contained to Italy. Okay? Just this part on the map here, it was almost all experienced by Italians. But then in the 1500s, Renaissance ideas and influence spread north, okay, beyond the Alps mountains right here, and it led to the German, the French, the English Renaissances, the Renaissance of the lowlands here, and collectively, okay, the Renaissance that happened north of Italy and all this area right here is known as the Northern Renaissance, and that mostly occurred during the 1500s. Now, the thing that caused the creation of the ideas that spread to the rest of Europe was the printing press. That is what caused the creations and the ideas of the Italian Renaissance to spread to the rest of the world. If it weren't for the printing press, the Renaissance would have remained in Italy forever and not really spread to the rest of the world. But through the printing press, you have Italian writings of people like Petrarch and Dante beginning to be printed in mass quantities, and it spread throughout France, throughout England, throughout the Holy Roman Empire, the Low Countries, which is pretty much the Netherlands and Belgium modern day, really spread throughout all of Northern Europe. And Italian art also traveled north, and Italian architectural designs began to influence Northern European architecture, and you start to see all of the different types of art and architecture and writings that were brought back in Italy. You see that being spread throughout Europe, and eventually it would spread throughout the world. So the whole concept of Renaissance humanism, we mentioned it as a philosophy, and it was really a cultural movement that its goal was to make the public more educated and literate. Make the public more educated, get people to read more, and that was the goal behind Renaissance humanism. So a Renaissance humanist would focus on kind of theorizing and postulating and teaching about language, about history, poetry, and even things like moral philosophy and ethics. That is what the humanists, the Renaissance humanists, focused on, was basically spreading education. All right, so that's why they're called humanists, is because they focused on the accomplishments of humans. Now, it's important to make a distinction here between modern day secular humanism and Renaissance humanism. So these days, a group of people called humanists are essentially those who don't believe in God, who are atheists, and see humans as the pinnacle of all of life. and no real higher power. So that's what secular humanism is today. Very different from Renaissance humanism. The Renaissance humanists were not atheists; they believed in God, but they really focused on the accomplishments of humans. All right, so Renaissance humanists are people like we're about to talk about, like Erasmus and Montaigne. Whereas secular humanists nowadays might be people like Richard Dawkins or Stephen Hawking or Bill Nye or someone like that. So very different things. To just need to make that clear. So one of the premier Renaissance humanist philosophers was Erasmus, and that was one of the options to do your project over. And he was a Renaissance humanist philosopher who wrote a lot about his thoughts on free will. He wrote a book called The Freedom of the Will, and basically expressed his belief and made a logical argument for the idea that humans have a capacity to choose whether or not to follow God or really you name it. And actually, Martin Luther, who we'll talk about next class, came along and wrote a kind of a rebuttal to Erasmus's book, The Freedom on the Will. And Martin Luther called it the bondage of the will, and said, really, it's not us who choose God, that God has really chosen all of us. They're interesting books if you ever want a good read there. Now, another really important guy was Montaigne. So he was also a leading humanist during the French Renaissance, a part of the Northern Renaissance. And he was a philosopher and a writer. And his works became very influential for writers that came just after him, for people like Shakespeare. Shakespeare was very influenced by Montaigne and his writings during the Northern Renaissance. Now, there were a lot of very good Northern Renaissance artists. You might not know their names like you know Da Vinci and Michelangelo, but one of the best artists of the Northern Renaissance, if not the best, was a guy named Albrecht Durer. Albrecht Durer, perhaps the greatest artist of the Northern Renaissance. What he did is, in his life, he made 2 trips to Italy and just soaked up all the knowledge that he could. He learned a great deal about his craft, learned about how to paint, how to make things look as realistic as possible, and he specialized in painting and also in printmaking, which is kind of like sketching. Now, his self-portrait, which you see on the right there, it's called Self-Portrait at 28. He painted himself there. And also another work, which you're about to see, called Praying Hands, which you probably looks familiar to you. Those are his 2 most famous works, and much of his art actually modeled the ideas of the Reformation. Now, if you look at how detailed that painting is right there, especially the hand. Now, if you know much about art, you know that the hands are one of the most difficult things to depict in art. It's really difficult to paint or to sketch a hand. Therefore, a lot of painters just avoid it altogether and don't put hands in their pictures. They'll just paint, someone's face or something like that. But if a painting has hands in it, it automatically becomes more valuable and more expensive because it's so difficult to do so accurately. But if you look at this printing on the right, or sorry, on the left, this sketch on the left that Albrecht Durer made called Praying Hands. You've probably seen it before. Just look at all that detail. I mean, you can see every wrinkle in the hands, every vein from underneath the skin. You can see the fingerprints, and it all looks so incredibly realistic. And this was sketched about 500 years ago. And then you have on the right this print that he made, that he literally etched it into wood and then lathered it in paint and put it on a printing press so you could make as many as you could. So all different types of art are really blossoming around this time. Now finally here, the term Renaissance man was kind of coined at this time, and what it meant to be a Renaissance man was to be a universal genius. So basically someone who's very skilled, very prolific in a bunch of different things. Someone who's really, really good at a lot of different things. I'm sure you can think of people in your own life who are like that, who are just smart about every topic. It's rare, but we all know a couple probably. But if you were just really good at many different types of art and science, like if you were a good painter and a good sculptor, and you could design buildings, and you also knew a lot about physics or philosophy, and you knew a bunch of different languages, then you were called a Renaissance man. So the classic example of a Renaissance man is Leonardo da Vinci. He definitely was a Renaissance man. Not only was he a great painter and artist in general, but he could also design buildings. He also knew math and science very, very well, and he was an inventor. So he is known as a Renaissance man. So there you go. That is the Renaissance kind of in a nutshell there. summarized in those 2 pages. So let me know if you have any questions or if I can explain anything in more detail for you.